Hello and welcome to Chapter 4. We're going to talk about genes, evolution, and behavior. So I'm going to do this Chapter 4 in 3 sections. I'm going to try to make 3 shorter videos for you. Genetic influences, that's what we're going to talk about in this one. We're going to talk about chromosomes and genes, dominant, recessive, and polygenic effects, and the Human Genome Project. And then in the next video, we'll be talking about Part 2 and Part 3 of Chapter 4. Our physical development and the building blocks of our mental development, it's all passed down in a form of a genetic blueprint from our parents. Okay? So in this, we're going to talk about how characteristics, say from our parents, are passed on to their offspring. Traits are determined by a pair of alleles, right? So trait being, say, blue eyes or brown eyes or hand size or big feet, small feet, anything like that. That's determined by what we call alleles. So for, say, blue eyes, you have a capital B, and that would be the dominant allele, right? And then you have a small b, would be a green, for green eyes. So in this situation, you've got the blue allele, you've got the green allele. The blue allele is dominant, and therefore you're going to have blue eyes, right? So with dominant alleles, if there's a dominant allele, that trait will always trump and win out. For recessive alleles, say 2 small b's for green eyes, both of them have to be the small allele in order for them to have green eyes. Okay? So in the text, then they talk about genotypes and phenotypes, and what's the difference between the two. So a genotype is the exact pairing of the alleles. So you'll see that as the capital B, small b, which both will result in blue eyes, or the 2 small b's. So those are called genotypes. The phenotype is the expression of that trait. Okay, it's what you see. So as you see under genotype there can be 3 possibilities for the genotype, but there's only 2 possibilities for the phenotype because the first 2 are blue and the next one is green. Okay, so it's important to remember the gene specifies the trait and the allele specifies the form that the gene takes. And that'll become more clear as we go through this chapter. So next, let's move on to chromosomes and genes. So within every cell, within the nucleus, there's 23 pairs of chromosomes. They're made of tightly coiled single molecule of DNA, and they contain the genetic information of the cell, so that determines the proteins that are made. So you can see on the right there, it's what's called a karyotype. And what that is, it's they have those for all different animals, but this is a karyotype pick of all the different chromosomes within the cell of a human. So you can see you get 1 chromosome from your mother, you get 1 from your father, okay? And there's the 23 pairs there. You'll also notice that in the bottom right there, one of the chromosomes is an XY. And that's the chromosome that determines the sex of the baby. Okay, so if it's got an XY, it's going to be a male, and if it's an XX, it's going to be a female. So in this case, this is the chromosomes of a male. So as I said above, a chromosome it's made up of a tightly coiled single molecule of DNA, right? Deoxyribonucleic acid. So what a gene is, it is a portion of that DNA. So it's a section that contains the code for a specific trait. Okay, so they tend to talk about it in small chunks, just to keep it simple. You can see that diagram at the bottom. So 1, say, inch of the DNA there at the bottom, it says gene. Okay, so that could be what's determining their eye color or the hair color or any other characteristic or trait. So DNA looks like a long spiraling ladder, right? So it basically contains the blueprint or the recipe for all living things. It's made up of 2 complementary strands. the two thicker pieces down the sides, and those are composed of a sugar phosphate. And then there's the 4 base nucleotides that are joining them together. You can see in the bottom right hand diagram there. So the 4 are the adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. So the A, we're going to call them ATCG, so we don't have to repeat that. So A and T are joined together. They're a pair. And then the C and the G, they're a pair, with the phosphate backbone supporting them on both sides. So they contain the genetic information, and DNA are able to self-replicate. The purpose of them, it contains the code. It's also long-term storage for code, and it contains the instructions for how to produce proteins, what proteins to produce, and for the RNA molecules. So we've talked about genes and how they carry the information that determines your traits, right? They contain the alleles. Gene makes up sections of the DNA, which is the double-stranded helix. We've talked about all of these things. And next we'll talk about the project talks about the Human Genome Project. Okay, and what is that? So a genome is a complete set of genes in an organism. So it's the study of all of the genes that comprise one organism. And the Human Genome Project was 1990. It was an international research project to map out all the genes of the human body. I found a very short video that shows how, over the course of the 13 years, the research were able to determine that there's over 20,500 genes in the human body. They were able to locate the order and the location of the genes. They weren't able to determine each function yet, but what it's really done is laid a really solid groundwork for researchers.
Thanks for stopping by. Today we are talking about the Human Genome Project. Before we discuss the actual project, I want to define what a genome is. So a genome is the complete set of genes in an organism. In the Human Genome Project, that organism is, of course, the human. There are several scientific techniques that made it possible to start and complete the Human Genome Project. These include DNA sequencing, polymerase chain reaction, and electrophoresis. The Human Genome Project was essentially an international research project to map the entire human genome, every section of DNA in a human cell, which is a lot, 3 billion base pairs, in fact. And they've mapped all of them, which took 13 years to complete. The project determined that there are about 20,500 genes in the human genome, and it also discovered the order and location of these genes. It didn't, however, identify what each gene does, and that research is ongoing and there's still a lot to learn. It continues to be a benefit to society as a massive information source for researchers to draw on and to continue their advances in both science and medicine. I hope this brief explanation has piqued your interest, and if you want to learn more, check the links in the description. Don't forget to check out some of my other videos and subscribe to keep up with my content.
So in this video we covered alleles, which determine the traits and the characteristics. We talked about genotype, which is the exact pairing of the alleles, the lettering, and there's 3 possibilities. And we talked about phenotype, which is the expression of the trait. We also talked about how some alleles are dominant and some are recessive. We talked about chromosomes, genes, and then the Human Genome Project. In part 2 of chapter 4, we're going to look at genetic influences on behavior.